Okay, I see people are coming in, which is great. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in a moment. Sorry for the delay. Welcome. Okay, we're just waiting for everybody to come in, but it's like a nice attendance today. And so Lisa you'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then last 15 for Q&A.
Yeah, I think it'll come in just over 45 minutes, but yeah, plenty of time for Q&A at the end.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. All right, and I think looks like most people are here. I'll give it another few seconds, but then we'll get started. I hope everybody is doing well. Good afternoon. And I see people here, greetings from Jerusalem, from Chicago, from Maidenhead, UK, from Phoenix and Victoria, British Columbia, and Fairbanks, New Jersey, Palo Alto. Wonderful. Okay, we'll give it another minute or two. I see people are coming in. Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires, Texas, Boynton Beach, Florida, Baja California, Petaluma. Wow. Edmonton is a very international, Chilham, Kent, UK, France. It's a very international group today. Okay. Looks like, all right. I think it looks like most people are here. So I'm going to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Rudensky. I'm the Senior Director for the Calico Center here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I'm delighted to welcome all of you today. And I'd like to introduce our special speaker today. Her name is Lisa Cooper. She is a British writer and artist based in Cornwall, United Kingdom. She studied Russian at the Edinburgh University and spent a year in the Soviet Union as a student. Armed with an address dating from the 1960s and a family tree, she made contact with cousins in Kiev, which was then part of the Soviet Ukraine, and they introduced her to a web of relatives she knew nothing about. The experience helped her breed an interest in both family history and Ukrainian Jewish history. She writes a blog about historical events relating to the Jewish communities of Ukraine and of Eastern Europe more widely. Currently, her focus is on the war in Ukraine with an emphasis on parallels with other tumultuous periods in Ukraine's tragic history. And she's got a blog, and and we could probably put this in the chat, her blog address if you want to follow her. We'll see if I can figure out how to get that in the chat. But while I don't want to delay, waste any of the time, Lisa's going to speak for about 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to present Lisa Cooper. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining us. So I'll get started. So I'm sure for many of us, the overriding interest we have in our genealogy research is the hunt for records. We may have unearthed documents that have helped us learn more about our ancestors. And as well as that, some of us may be lucky enough to have photographs. These can give us a tiny insight into our ancestors' lives, maybe how they dressed. Perhaps you get the excitement of seeing a family resemblance. But records and photographs can only ever give us little glimpses of our family history. Few of us are able to really understand how our families lived back in the old country. The routine of their daily lives, the historical events that they lived through, and the effects that those events had on our ancestors' communities and on them as individuals. What most of us lack is stories, family stories. So I'm doubly lucky in that respect. I'm lucky, firstly, that my grandmother was a great storyteller. Whereas so many Jewish immigrants to the West refused to talk about the old country, choosing to forget the unhappy times and not to pass on their memories. And I'm lucky, secondly, that my father went to great lengths to keep these family stories alive. And back in the 1970s, when my grandma was an old lady, my dad made recordings in Yiddish on old cassette tapes of my grandmother telling her stories of life back in Russia. And Grandma lived through a very dramatic period in early 20th century Russia, a period of great upheaval, terrible suffering, especially for Jews. But hers is also a remarkable story, a story of resilience, bravery, and hope. And this is a story about ordinary people trying to lead ordinary lives, but in very extraordinary times. And if your family came from the shtetls of present-day Ukraine or elsewhere in the old Russian Empire, a lot of this is going to be the background to your own family history too. And if your family came from Poland or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, many of my grandma's stories of growing up in a shtetl will likely be similar to those in your own family history too. Now, on occasion, people have said to me that my presentation or my book isn't really of interest to them because their family were Holocaust survivors. But I say to them that, their family history didn't start with the Holocaust. My grandma's stories will give an idea of how all of our ancestors lived in the decades before the horrors of World War II. So I hope through this presentation that you'll get a better sense of how our people lived and died in those times. So hopefully now you can see the cover of the book on the screen. So this is my grandmother right in the middle. Her name was Pearl. This photo would have been taken around 1914, so shortly before the start of World War I. And Pearl's father, which is this chap that I'm circling here, he died. In fact, he died of the typhus epidemic just after World War I. So the book is my grandmother's story. Pearl lived in a town called Pavlich, about 60 miles southwest of Kiev. Today, of course, it's in Ukraine. Back then, it was part of the Russian Empire. It was a melting pot of different nationalities, different religions. Pearl grew up speaking Yiddish as her mother tongue, intermingled with spatterings of Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian. On her mother's side, the family were prosperous grain dealers. And on her father's side, they were religious scholars. So, being scholars, they were very poor, but highly respected in the Jewish community. Now, Pearl's mother died when she was 6. This is her mother here. This little girl standing is Pearl, my grandmother, her older sister Sarah, and her baby brother Naftula. There's another little girl, her sister Rachel, born after this photo was taken. Now, after her mother died, Pearl was brought up by her grandparents, Beryl and Pessy, in a large house that also served as a warehouse for her grandfather's grain business. The grandma was the second of 4 children. And in the same house with them also lived 2 cousins, her mother's sister's children. All 6 children were orphaned young. Certainly they lost their mothers young, and the cousins lost their father young as well, leaving them in the care of their grandparents. Now I've got a photo of, this is Baba Pessy. And she was terrified of the evil eye. And if you've heard any stories of your own from grandparents who lived in the shtetls, you've probably heard about the evil eye. If it was the bane of every Jewish mother or grandmother. If something bad happened to the family, if a child got sick, if marriage fell apart, whatever, it was all because somebody had cast an evil eye on you. And there were various ways of trying to dispel the evil eye. Once it had been cast, you could go and visit a local specialist who you'd need to take a thread from the clothing of the person who you believe cast the evil eye on you, and the local kind of expert in dispelling the evil eye would burn it over hot coals and spit 3 times and do some kind of shamanistic ritual, and that was supposed to get rid of the evil eye. Now, Pessy believed that having a photo taken would cast an evil eye on her. So when she was younger, she would refuse to have photos taken, and I believe that by this stage, when she was much older, she thought, well, what the heck? I'm old now, so um, I'll allow a photo to be taken. Um, Now, before Pearl was born, so we'll go to the sort of history side of it. Um, in particular, the period from 1881 to 1905. In the Pale of Settlement, which I'm sure most of you know is the area of the Russian Empire where Jews were restricted to living under the Tsars. This area at this time saw terrible violence against the Jews, the pogroms as we know them. And the pogroms were tolerated and often even encouraged by the Tsar. So my first reading from the book is about the outbreak of the pogroms in 1881. Ah, that'll serve the man right, were my grandfather's first words when he heard about the explosion that had killed Tsar Alexander II. And the book is written in my grandmother's voice in the first person. So this is my grandma speaking. Although the Tsar had achieved a reputation as a great reformer for freeing the serfs, my grandfather grumbled that he hadn't done so much to emancipate the Jews. It was true that our people gained some limited freedoms under his rule. Forced conscription of children was halted. More Jews were able to attend Russian schools and universities. But emancipation, this most definitely was not. My grandfather was soon eating his words, however, for the events that ensued rocked the lives not just of my family, but of every single Jew right across the Pale. After the Tsar's assassination, rumours began to spread. To begin with, the Jews weren't aware of the gossip and the whispering. It took place surreptitiously, inside houses in the Christian parts of town. But then it spread to the shops, the markets, and the train stations. The rumours were everywhere. It was Jewish revolutionaries that had killed the Tsar, and it was time for revenge. Inebriated mobs pulled down market stalls, smashed shop windows, and kicked in doors in towns and cities across the Pale. Velvet dresses and woolen shawls, picture frames and broken chair legs, cabbages, bottle plums, all were trampled underfoot or piled up in grotesque mountains of mud. And everywhere there was screaming. Running feet, fearful faces, trying to stay out of sight. A snowstorm of white feathers cascaded out of windows and hovered in the air, having been ripped from mattresses and pillows. Some of the rioters dressed themselves up in new outfits stolen from the ready-made clothes stores, piling one layer over another, shirts over jackets and underwear over trousers, until they looked like characters in some absurd stage play. How to count the cost? How many honest traders and merchants bankrupted? How many families bereft of all they had spent their whole lives working towards? How many children so traumatized that they would forever relive the fear in their dreams? So that was 1881. And these waves of violence against the Jews were repeated regularly over the following years. Eventually, they died down again. And then a second wave of pogroms occurred again in 1905. Now, this was the year that the first major signs of revolution were felt in Russia. Well, the Russian Revolution, as we know it, was in 1917, 12 years later. But in 1905, Russia saw rebellions, uprisings, workers striking, marching through the streets, waving red banners. Lots of Jews joined in the demonstrations and the marches, protesting about the discrimination that still affected their daily lives. And once again, just like in 1881, this Jewish involvement in the revolution caused an anti-Semitic backlash. And this time it was even more bloody than in 1881. As well as raiding Jewish shops and businesses, the so-called Black Hundreds, they were the groups, they were like the Tsar's vigilante groups, basically violent mobs. The Black Hundreds killed Jews in their own homes. They even hacked people to death in the streets. It was a horrendous period of violence. But most of that violence was restricted to the major towns and cities. Small towns like Pavlich, where my family lived, were generally spared. And although people lived with the fear of what was going on elsewhere, they continued to lead a normal life. I've got two readings about what life was like in my grandmother's childhood. So here she is first, talking about her life day to day as a child. I had few cares as a young child. Just as my mother had been cosseted in her youth, my sister Sarah and I were brought up like the daughters of a princess. Our mother shunned the local tailor, and instead we travelled to the town of Berdichev to visit the dressmaker who made us fashionable outfits fringed with velvet and lace. I loved these visits to the city. I was always enthralled by the clamour of the market traders and the horse-drawn streetcars that clattered along the cobblestones. And then there was the excitement of collecting our new clothes. We believed we would be the best dressed girls in all of Pavlich. Like our mother before us, we girls were never taught to sew or darn or cook. Baba was responsible for looking after the needs of the entire household, as well as helping Zeta by collecting the takings from his warehouse and keeping his books up to date. A tiny, energetic woman whose life sorrow was reflected in her eyes. She was the linchpin of the family. And I'm talking here about Baba Pessi, who you can see on the screen. Baba never let a single second go to waste. Every morning she would rise at daybreak to milk her cow, light the fires, and then set to work on the kitchen floor, scrubbing the flagstones until they sparkled. As her children and grandchildren washed and dressed, she prepared the table for breakfast. The kitchen was her domain, and she ruled it as strictly and efficiently as Zeta ran his warehouse. In any quiet moments, she was always to be found there, knitting needles clicking, a ball of wool trailing across the floor, as she engaged in the never-ending task of knitting and darning the family's socks and stockings. Every afternoon was spent chopping, boiling, frying, and best of all, pastry making. As befits the wife of a successful grain merchant, Baba too had a special relationship with wheat. The fine milled flour it produced came alive as she caressed it in her gnarled hands. She could make a ball of pastry dance, stretching the dough over both knobbly fists, pulling it and turning it in the air like a magician with a wand, creating paper-thin sheets that were an even thickness from one side to the other. For me, seeing Baba at work was as mesmerizing as watching conjuring tricks. Now, I mentioned that her life sorrow was reflected in her eyes. Her life sorrow was that she gave birth to no fewer than 13 children, only 2 of whom survived into adulthood. My great grandmother and her sister, and they both died very young, leaving young children. Appel's early life was full of stories of arranged marriages, dowries, her father's morning prayer rituals, his hours spent studying the Talmud, her grandmother's Sabbath preparations, scrubbing the tables and chairs, shining the silverware and starching the tablecloths, preparing the challah and the gefilte fish, and exchanging everyday clothes for their special Sabbath outfits. And the next reading I'm going to give is a little bit about her grandfather's grain business and how people did business in those days. And sadly, we don't have any photos of her grandfather. He was quite an impatient man, a bit of a fierce man, as you'll find out later. And I think he probably would have considered photographs to be a bit frivolous, and probably he was too impatient to sit for a photographer. But this is what he did. International commerce in an era before telephones and without established rates of exchange was a complex and time-consuming affair. Every day his driver waited with a coach and horse to take him to the train station at Popilna, a small town 12 miles from Pavlich, where he would await news from each train that passed of the prices currently being paid for different products further up or down the line. Market rates in Kiev, and export prices in Odessa, the region's major port. The railway station was a daunting place for outsiders. When I was little, and this is my grandmother talking, when I was little, I occasionally travelled to visit relatives by train with my parents. I remember dodging between the swarms of traders from all over the area who congregated to discuss prices and close deals with travelling businessmen. My father would scoop me up in his arms so I didn't get lost or trampled, and the noise was so loud, with frenzied shouts and hand gestures from all sides, that I couldn't understand how anyone was able to follow what was going on. While the railway station provided a daily price lists of goods and exchange rates, most of my grandfather's major business contracts were actually sealed in Kiev. He took the train to the city 60 miles away about once a week, and from the end of February to late March each year, he would spend a month in Kiev visiting the annual commodity exchange that was held there. As we lived in Europe's principal grain producing region, the Kiev Commodities Exchange was a major international affair. Agents and dealers from all over Europe congregated in the city to examine the quality of produce, meet suppliers, and negotiate prices. And this was where the majority of Zeta's international business was conducted. And of course, we've seen again in the current war the importance of Ukraine as a grain exporter and the importance of keeping those Black Sea routes open for grain exports. So that was their life before the First World War. But everything changed in 1914 when the war broke out. So Grandma was about 12 when the war started. And although the battlefields were hundreds of miles from Pavlich, the war still had a profound effect on the town that my family came from and from the lives of everybody who lived there, as they would have done right across Europe. The comfortable life that my grandmother had led up to that point was shattered once and for all. And one of the first changes that they would have noticed was something that had a huge effect on her grandfather's grain business. So that was my next reading. After Germany declared war in 1914, the train station at Popilna changed from a stock exchange into an army embarkation point. Goods trains no longer brought news of grain prices from Kiev and Odessa, but transported military apparel to the distant front, and passenger services were replaced by troop carriers. Instead of throbbing with merchants and speculators, the train stations were drenched in the tears of mothers, wives, and children, waving their beloved goodbye as they ran along the platform until it ended and they could run no further. Instead of talk of prices, bushels, poods, and exchanges, all conversation was of mobilization, detachments, regiments, and ultimatums. My grandfather's routine was disrupted without his trips to the station. Although he no longer had to visit Popilna every day, he still undertook the journey once or twice a week, and now even this was denied to him, and he began to pace around the house restlessly. He missed his outings and the social contact that they provided, and he despaired over the murkiness that was settling over grain prices. The daily dealings at the train station had kept pricing transparent. Dealers knew how much was being paid for each product at every location, but now it was impossible to keep track. To make matters worse, inflation had started to increase, making it more important than ever to keep a close eye on the market. But exchange rates, tariffs, and prices were all becoming harder and harder to gauge. They rose gradually at first, then faster and faster, until they were running out of control, like a downhill sledge on an icy track. And all over Pavlich, families were fearful of their menfolk being sent off to war. And some of my grandmother's older cousins had already managed to escape to Canada to avoid being called up by the military authorities. We'd had family members who'd left for Canada about a decade earlier, and they were able to go and join the family in Winnipeg to avoid military service. But once the war started, it was too late to escape. But many men, Jews and Gentiles alike, tried to evade conscription at all costs, and this was my family's experience. Thankfully, my father wasn't called up to fight in the first months of the war. As the menfolk of Pavlich marched off to the station to fill the never-ending lines of trains heading for the front, I prayed every night and every day that my father wouldn't one day join them. He wasn't meant for fighting, this gentle, studious man who still dressed every day in his long black coat and skull cap. The first wave of recruits were green ticketers. My father hoped to be granted a blue ticket, which would mean he was allowed to study rather than go to war. Only the feeble-minded and the infirm were lucky enough to be granted a white ticket, which exempted them altogether, while those who failed the medical exam were red ticketers. Pavlich was full of young men trying to make themselves ill by fasting, drinking salty water, or even overindulging in salted herring to try and gain a red ticket. The rich took a different tack, bribing doctors or officials to reject their sons. Meanwhile, the mothers of one or two young men we knew ran themselves ragged, going from one office to another through the warren of Russian officialdom, trying to prove that their last remaining boy should get the automatic exemption that applied to only sons. The official registers were notoriously inaccurate, and many hadn't been updated properly when people had died or emigrated. But the process of verifying that a son was unavailable for service could cause weeks of frustration and distress. Now, avoiding conscription in Russia was nothing new, and probably particularly for Jewish families. In my own family, Pearl's great-grandfather, whose name was Akiva, when he was a young man, the Happers were active. They were the Tsar's recruiting officers, trying to recruit children, some as young as 7 or 8, or young men, to recruit them into the Tsar's army. And for Jewish boys, once they were there, they were no longer able to uphold the Jewish laws and traditions. They would have to march on the Sabbath. They couldn't keep the kosher laws, and they would be taken until they were in their 30s, till they were men. Also, if I go back to the front cover, you see that Pearl's family name was Unikow. It's a very unusual name. It's not a Jewish name, it's a Ukrainian name. And this is because Pearl's grandfather on her father's side, so her father's father, he underwent a false adoption by a Ukrainian family by the name of Unikov, so that this would exempt him and his older brother from military service in an earlier war, in about 1870s, I think, because there were 2 boys in the family. If they got separated, one got adopted by a childless family, that meant that they were both an only son, and so they were both exempt from military service. Later on, Naftula, so my grandma's younger brother, who I'm circling now, he hid under piles of grain in his grandfather's warehouse in 1920 to avoid conscription into the Red Army when the Bolshevik government was invading or fighting against Poland. And he eventually managed to escape. He initially escaped the recruiting officers hiding under piles of grain, and then disappeared in the dead of night to get to Moldova, then Romania. Eventually managed to work his way up to Trieste in Italy, and from there get passage by ship to join the rest of the family in Canada. But back to World War One. So life became harder as food and equipment were sent away to the front, leaving very little to spare for those left at home. And thanks to Pearl's grandfather's grain business, my family still had enough to eat. But in the cities, people were going hungry, and with insufficient insufficient fuel available for people to heat their homes, many got sick. As the war dragged on year after year, the hardships increased for the ordinary people of Russia. In the major cities, those hardships led to massive unrest, culminating eventually in the revolutions of 1917. So the revolution began in February when the Tsar was overthrown, and this was followed by the October Revolution when the Bolsheviks seized power. And small towns like Pavlich were fairly immune from the revolutionary fervor. But here's a description of what was happening in Kiev, as I said, about 60 miles away from where my family lived. And this was at the time of the February Revolution. People talked openly, fearlessly in the streets about the end of the Tsar's reign. They talked about Russia withdrawing from the war and abandoning her allies, power to the workers, People's Soviets. Students handed out leaflets and waved red banners. What did it all mean? Would the war soon be over? Could the Tsar just resign? How can the workers take power? And what were the Soviets? To a 15-year-old girl in a small country town, the reports from the city were very mysterious. But far away to the north, in Petrograd, as the Russian capital was now called, the demonstrations were coming to a head, and at last they culminated in the Tsar's abdication. It was as if a black cloud had lifted from above our heads. Alexander Kerensky and his provisional government filled the power void left by Tsar Nicholas and represented everything we had ever hoped for. My sister Sarah came home from school early, rejoicing that she would no longer have to sing the national anthem. The hated God Save the Tsar was now banned. The Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were restricted to living, was dissolved at a single blow. Censorship was abolished, and my grandfather began devouring newspapers and every other source of information he could find, hungry for news that had not previously been considered fit for public consumption. No more Tsar, no more restrictions on Jewish jobs and residence permits. Now we had the same rights as everybody else in the country. I didn't understand the politics of it all, but I could feel the difference in my daily life. The mood of oppression that had settled over Pavlich since the beginning of the war was suddenly lifted. People smiled, chatted, laughed. They talked about their hopes and dreams. They voiced aspirations that they'd never dared speak of before. Some even danced in the street. Zeta was more cheerful than he had been in years, and Bubba's eyes sparkled in a way that I'd hardly ever seen. But Kerensky's leadership of the country, of course, was all too brief, ended by the Bolshevik Revolution that October. And for ordinary people in Russia, the October Revolution caused great uncertainty. Ukraine was far away from Petrograd, where the revolution took place, and really nobody knew very much about Lenin and his fellow revolutionaries. And certainly nobody could have predicted at that time that they would have remained in power for most of the 20th century. But one of the first things that the Bolsheviks did was to extricate Russian troops from the war. Now, this was something that had a huge effect on places like Pavlich. So this is what happened. Over the weeks that followed, the railways became a teeming mass of humanity. Not even my grandfather would dare to go to the train station in Popilna now. His once daily haunt was heaving with unwashed bodies, many racked with disease and crawling with lice, as soldiers dribbled back home from distant lands, weak, thin, and bedraggled like stray cats after a storm. From the window, I watched the slow, trudging progress through town of these grey bundles of bones, men who had once represented the Tsar's brave army. Townsfolk took pity on the returning troops and went out of their way to offer them soup, give them any old clothes and shoes that they could spare. Even after 3.5 years of wartime hardships, it was clear that the privation we had all suffered was nothing compared with the needs of the soldiers. But week after week, the ragged creatures kept on coming, more and more of them, until people began to worry that if they kept giving their food and clothing away, they would have nothing left. And as the months passed, the reality dawned that the pale, unshaven men crisscrossing the countryside with guns couldn't all be soldiers returning to their homes after all. So who were these men? It eventually became clear that bands of armed thugs were roaming the land. It was impossible to tell who was who, but gradually all those generous souls in Pavlich who'd been welcoming the soldiers home with hot soup instead began hiding away their potatoes and their winter boots, lest the men take them all. The other thing that the Bolsheviks did after they gained power was start requisitioning grain from the countryside to feed the workers. And as well as taking grain from the peasants, they also raided the supplies of grain merchants like Pearl's grandfather. So this is what happened to him. The Bolsheviks viewed merchants like my grandfather as class enemies. They also needed grain to feed their supporters in the cities, which were running out of food. Zeta knew that a knock at the door was inevitable, but when it came, he was still caught by surprise. My grandparents knew young Vanya well. He was Sasha the baker's son, and he lived down the road. They'd watched him grow up, from a wailing baby in his mother's arms to a smart young schoolboy and later a recruit in the Tsar's army. When he came to the house, Baba almost shrieked as she pulled open the door. She barely recognized him in the black leather coat that reached down to his calves and heavy black boots. In his hand was a wooden truncheon. He was surrounded by a group of youths, all in identical black clothing, talking loudly to one another. But Vanya was clearly their leader. Zeta hurried to the door, alerted by the commotion and the rush of cold air. Vanya, he exclaimed, what are you doing here, young man? Vanya looked a little sheepish, perhaps embarrassed that his fellow Bolsheviks could see that he had associated with class enemies like my grandfather in the past. One of his Red Guards pushed Baba aside and headed towards the warehouse. The Bolsheviks are in charge now, and we need to take your grain to feed the workers in the towns, he dictated as he stamped through the house. But what about us? Who will feed us if you take away our grain? Baba countered. You bourgeois, you're all the same. The workers and peasants need bread if they're going to build socialism. Bread, land, and freedom. Zayda just sat in his chair and watched as Vanya and his friends shoveled away at the pyramids of grain until all that was left was a few thin scatterings of yellow spread across the grey stone floor like dirt that had come in from the street and needed sweeping up. He knew he couldn't argue with them. He'd heard the news on the grapevine. Grain merchants all over Ukraine were having their stores ransacked. It was clear that from this day on, our lives would never be the same again. And although the Bolsheviks had pulled Russia out of the war, they failed to deliver peace. And all over Ukraine and other parts of the Russian Empire, the October Revolution gave way to anarchy. There were newly formed bands of rebels and fighters crisscrossing the land. Each group had a different allegiance. Some fought for nationalism, for anarchism, for Holy Russia. Sometimes it seemed just for the sake of fighting. These different militarized groups, my grandmother called them banda. And she didn't really differentiate between, which banda. They were just banda. And this was the start of the Civil War. Pavlich and the surrounding area was the scene of many battles and atrocities from 1918 to 1920. And I'm going to give a reading about one of the many incidents that took place during that time. And this involved the White Army under their Cossack leader, General Denikin. And the Cossacks were fiercely anti-Bolshevik, but also fiercely anti-Semitic. And the White Army, incidentally, was supported by the West, financed largely by Britain and France and other allies for their opposition to Bolshevism. 5 huge men burst in through the front door. They were clad in tatty greatcoats that reached almost to the floor. Grease pencil marks indicated their rank, outlining stars that had once been sewn onto their shoulder straps. Long shining swords were tucked into their belts, and they carried rifles fixed with rusty bayonets. The tops of their heads almost touched the ceiling, and with each great stride they squeezed my grandparents into the corners of the room, where they cowered shaking. The Whites weren't like the anarchists who burst in and began smashing the furniture to pieces. They had brains and intuition that they used to figure out just where their victims might be hiding money or jewelry, or hoarding food. The soldiers sniffed around like dogs, tapping at walls and floorboards, listening for a hollow echo that might indicate a hiding place. Money! Give us your money, old man, the first giant had demanded in Russian, prodding Zayda with his bayonet. My grandfather's carefully learned Russian seemed to desert him, and he mumbled something incomprehensible, his eyes fixed on the scuffed leather boots of his interrogator. While the others continued to search the house, kicking down the door to the warehouse, the leader of the group dealt my grandfather a swift blow with his rifle butt and watched poor Zayda crumple to the floor like a rag doll. Then he kicked him in the stomach with his huge leather boots until Zayda curled into a ball on the hard kitchen floor as pitiful as a tiny child. Again and again he beat him with his gun and kicked him. And by that time the other 4 soldiers had returned. Zayda wasn't a big man, so it didn't take them long to hustle him onto the table, pull his scuffed leather belt from around his waist, and force his head into the noose that they made with it. Then they hanged him from a hook on the kitchen ceiling that we used for drying meat. Now he survived because the belt snapped once the banda had left, and he fell to the floor. Grandma also recounted another story about that belt before the war, when they would sit down to the dinner table to have their Sabbath meal. As I said, he was a bit of a fierce man and an impatient man, and before the Sabbath meal, he would pull each of his grandchildren up one after another and tell them off for some misdemeanor that they'd committed over the week. And he would take off that leather belt from around his waist, and he would whack his grandchildren, whip his grandchildren, give them a couple of beatings with it, and then they would go and sit down, and the next child would come up and get told off and get a beating. So I do wonder if those beatings that he gave his grandchildren possibly weakened that belt enough to save his life. How are we doing for time? I'll just recount very quickly one more incident, a different bander also coming through Pavlich at a different time. My family had heard the warnings that a bander was on its way and had gone off to hide with a Ukrainian neighbor so that they might be safe. But Pearl had broken her leg. Her leg was in a cast and she couldn't run. So she went up to the attic of their house and waited alone. Her grandfather, Zada, went off and said, "Listen, I can't carry you. I'm old and weak. I'll see if the neighbour is there. He's a big, strong chap. He should be able to carry you to safety." So Zada went off, leaving Pearl on her own in the attic. And she was sitting there by herself and heard a gunshot ring out really, really close by. Obviously, she was petrified. She could do nothing. She just sat and waited. And when the family got back, she found out that her grandfather had alerted the neighbour and he was on his way to fetch her, to take her to safety when he was shot and died, shot and killed. And that's a hell of a thing to carry with you for the rest of your life, that you were responsible for, for the death of that neighbour. I think that must have stayed with my grandmother. So back to 1920. So towards the end of the Civil War, by 1920, the Bolsheviks' grip on the power in Ukraine had become much stronger, although the fighting and raids hadn't died down altogether. The Banda were still around, but much weakened. But what followed was a period of great hunger and deprivation. The Bolshevik government continued to requisition food supplies from the countryside. And even in Ukraine, which was known then as the breadbasket of Europe, and still is known as that for its huge grain production, it was next to impossible to buy wheat or flour. They hadn't only requisitioned the grain, but also the seed grain, so that the peasants couldn't grow any crops the following year. The only bread that you could buy was on the black market, and that was made up of dirt from the road, even mushed up soldiers' coats. There really wasn't much wheat or grain in there. And as well as bread, sugar, potatoes, eggs, milk, all of these things had become either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. And that's not to mention meat. And inflation was pushing prices up by the day. It reached a point where barter became the main means of doing business, and it became increasingly difficult for families to find enough food. Now, at this point, my grandmother took on the role of finding food to feed her family. She was not yet 20 years old, but both her parents were dead. Her grandparents were getting old and no longer had the strength to take on the role of being the breadwinner, particularly her grandfather, who'd suffered at the hands of the Cossacks when he was hanged, and he'd never fully recovered from that. So to enable her grandparents, her siblings, and her cousins to survive, Pearl took on terrifying and dangerous journeys by train to markets across the area. And these markets were illegal. And if she'd been caught, Grandma most likely would have been shot. So this picture shows what she looked like at that time. This is my grandma here. This is her older sister Sarah in the chair, and her younger sister Rachel on the right. So got a couple more readings. This one is about what Pearl went through to get enough food for her family to survive. It was still several years before regular train services were to resume, and there were no timetables and no carriages for passengers. It wasn't possible to just buy a ticket and climb aboard. In fact, officially, ordinary people weren't allowed on board at all. Trains appeared whenever their cargoes of goods or troops were ready. This meant sometimes they travelled through Popilna to Kiev or Odessa 3 times a day, and other times it was more like 3 times a week. Every so often they stopped at our station, but on many occasions they didn't. If the train didn't stop, I had to leap aboard while it was moving and cling on for dear life until I had the chance to find a better spot, on a footplate between carriages, perched on top of a freight car, or crouching in the corner of an empty wagon. I learnt how to leap into the doorway of a freight car, to aim for the gap between the wagons, or even, if the train was travelling slowly enough, to crawl in between the wheels and work my way up to the carriage roof. Not only were traders at risk of being attacked and robbed, but officials were known to offer bribes to informers, and in return for a hunk of bread or a handful of rubles, any of these people could report me to the authorities for dealing in contraband goods. So, to avoid the risk, I threw myself off the train just before reaching the station and gave the whole area a wide berth. Jumping off was much worse than boarding the train in the first place. At least in winter, deep drifts of snow lay either side of the train tracks, creating a soft bed to land in. But when spring arrived, the embankments were piled high with blackened slush, which towered above deep puddles that I had to try to avoid. And later in summer, when the ground was hard, I came home spotted with inky bruises where I'd hit the ground. So Pearl spent the next 3 years doing these journeys by train, buying, selling, bartering, getting hold of whatever goods she could to feed her family or to sell back in Pavlich, and sometimes staying away from home overnight. There was one memorable occasion where she got caught in a snowstorm and almost died from the cold. She was finally taken in by a kindly lady in a nearby village who fed her and looked after her until she was well enough to get home and the storm had subsided and she was able to get back to Pavlich. And her grandparents rather, had given her up for dead. When they saw her come in through the door, they thought it was the ghost of her granddaughter returning. But being very small, Pearl was often able to hide in places where she could eavesdrop on conversations about the conversations of other traders and gain insights and information that she could use to her advantage, things like where certain goods were available. And eventually, through overhearing conversations about it, she became a black market gold dealer. And my final reading from the book is about what she did at this time. My grandparents collected coins, rings, medals, jewelry, any gold that family and friends or acquaintances still had. Young women gave earrings and bracelets that they'd been saving for their wedding trousseau. Mothers offered medals awarded to their dead sons for their bravery. Wives even gave up their wedding rings. All these goods were given to my grandparents on trust and hidden in secret compartments that Baba sewed into my tattered coat. I took the gold hundreds of miles away to Kharkiv. The journey was murderous. Once I jumped off the train in Kiev, I had to work my way across to the other side of the jumble of stinking huts that made up the main station and leap aboard a train heading east. The trains were a different design from those travelling between Kiev and Odessa, and they offered no means of climbing onto the roof, nor even inside the carriages. Instead, I perched on the wooden boards that ran across the wheel axles. There was very little space. The icy wind whistled straight through me, and the noise of the wheels on the tracks was almost deafening. But these tiny platforms were in great demand. Occasionally, with a sinister howl, the train would jerk or brake fiercely, and somebody tumbled from the platform. It would have been almost impossible not to fall underneath the wheels. Even if the train didn't stop, it took all day to reach Kharkiv. More often, it stopped repeatedly in the middle of nowhere, the endless miles of woodland revealing nothing of our location. But I never dared to jump down and stretch my legs. It was far too risky. There was no timetable to indicate when the train might move again. And besides, I was fearful of losing my precious spot above the wheels. If I gave it up, the other travellers might never let me back on board. And at the end of each journey, I thanked God that I was still alive. Once in Kharkiv, through a complex network of contacts, I was introduced to some shady dealers who asked me to follow them to the back of the market. I was almost shaking with nerves the first time I stepped behind the brick wall that separated me from the other market traders, who might have offered some protection. The men were gruff but brisk, well dressed if not well mannered. They inspected my goods meticulously and then handed over hard currency in return. I hid the money away carefully in my secret pockets before stepping back into the marketplace. Now, if she'd been caught either with the hard currency or with the gold, the penalty would have been the same. She would have been shot. My grandmother wasn't the only person traveling illegally on the trains. Thousands of other people were doing exactly the same thing as she was, taking enormous risks just to try and enable their families to have enough food to eat. Finally, my grandmother couldn't take it anymore. She felt she had to escape from this terrifying life, and she hated it with a passion, but she just somehow felt compelled that this was her duty, to do this, because nobody else, she felt nobody else in the family could do it. But many Jews had emigrated from Russia during the years of the pogroms, and the first of our relatives to leave Russia had come to Canada in about 1903 and settled in Winnipeg. As I mentioned, subsequent family members came to avoid conscription. And finally, in 1924, Pearl managed to go and join them in Canada. Over the course of a year or so, she worked hard and she raised enough money to bring the rest of her family to join her there. And the next picture shows the whole family assembled in Winnipeg. Baba Pessi in the middle, still the linchpin of the family. Um, she's surrounded by her grandchildren and their partners. They all live together, just as they had back in Pavlich. Pessi controlled the control of the purse strings. So each of the grandchildren went out to work and they would keep a little bit of money to themselves and give the rest to Baba. She continued to cook and look after the house. And you see how old she looks in this picture, just testament to the hard life she'd led, because she was about in her mid-60s when she died. So we've got, this is Pearl, my grandmother here, my grandfather Itzik. This is her older sister Sarah and her husband. This is her brother Nathan. He was, as he was known in Canada, Naftila, as he was known in Russia, and his wife. And this is her younger sister Rachel and her young cousin Mendel. There are two people missing from this photo. Zeta Beryl, her grandfather, is missing. You can see that Baba Pessi is in her widow's rags. So Pearl's grandfather died before the family was able to escape to Canada. Although I'd said he was a very harsh man, quite a violent man. Pearl was desperately fond of him. She was said there was a humour under there. There was a soft heart underneath his brash exterior. And he had given Pearl everything, anything he had to enable her to leave and get to the West. He was the one who insisted that she go when she had doubts. And she said later, he gave me his soul so that I could leave. And when she said to him, but how are you going to survive if I leave? Who's going to provide for you? And the answer was always the same: God will provide. And the other person missing from this photo is cousin Baya. So I told you that Pearl was one of 4 children, but also living in the same house with them were 2 cousins, her mother's sister's children. So Baya was the older one, and Morris, who we saw in the previous picture, he was the younger of the 2 cousins. Now, Baya didn't come with the rest of the family to Canada. She was at university at that time in Kiev, and she was engaged to be married. She decided to stay. She was still in Kiev in 1941 when the Nazis invaded and occupied the area. And she was one of a group of Jews who were herded onto a boat on the Dnieper River that runs through the center of Kiev. And the boat was set alight, and there were no survivors. So my story finishes where Pearl and Itzik getting married. This is 1926. This obviously is their wedding photo. And later that year, my Aunt Lil, my dad's older sister, was born. And 6 years later, in 1932, my father was born. Now, Pearl moved to Los Angeles from Winnipeg in 1956 because both my Aunt Lil and my dad had ended up in Los Angeles. By the time I knew my grandmother, This is what she looked like when I knew her in the 1970s and early 80s. And I never knew her terribly well because we lived so far apart. Um, she was living at this time in a little apartment in North Hollywood on the second floor of a block of apartments around a swimming pool. She was a tiny, fragile, stooped old lady with skin so wrinkled that it was like an old walnut. And writing her story so long after she died, I found it incredibly hard to equate the person recounting the stories with my grandma. She was just so frail and so tiny that could not imagine how she could have jumped on and off trains, how she could have endured all those physical hardships. The other thing I found amazing, of course, was thinking that how she and I, just 2 generations apart, had led such vastly different lives. And of course, she came close to death on so many occasions, and if she hadn't survived, I wouldn't be here now. Before I finish, I'm just going to put on a little slideshow of some pictures of Pavlich that I took when my father and I visited Ukraine back in 2005. And while that's running, I'll quickly say a few words about how the book came about. So as I mentioned, I've got my dad to thank for that. So Dad was a historian. He studied at UCLA before he won a scholarship to Cambridge, Cambridge University in the UK. And in 1959, he emigrated to England. And that's where he met my mum, and that's how I turned out to be British. And my dad later became a professor of history in a city called Norwich, which is where I grew up. And back in the 1970s, when Pearl was an old lady, Dad made these recordings in Yiddish, as I mentioned. Now, I always knew of the recordings. I always knew of the existence of these tapes, but I didn't know Yiddish. And as a child, I was never interested enough to ask Dad about them. Then, when I was studying for a master's in Russian history, I thought it might be interesting to write my dissertation about the Russian Civil War, which I knew that Grandma had lived through. And it was then that I asked my dad if he would translate the tapes for me. Now, hour after hour, Dad translated while I typed, and I was simply astounded by the stories. I had absolutely no idea what my grandmother and her family had gone through. And at that point, I decided to give up on the dissertation and the masters. And instead, I set about turning Grandma's stories into a book. And if you'd like to hear a few snippets from the cassettes or to hear some more of Pearl's stories in her own words, you might be interested in a short radio documentary that I made with the BBC a couple of years ago. And I think the link to it will be, this is what it looks like. The link to that will be in the follow-up email that you will be receiving from Jewish Gen. You might also be interested in my blog, where I post topics of Jewish interest in Ukraine in particular, but also sort of Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Again, you should get the link sent to you in the follow-up email. And at the moment, my focus is largely on the war in Ukraine. But there's a box there on the web page where you can sign up to get the latest posts sent to you by email. And I hope we've got about 5-10 minutes left for questions, Paul, if that's okay.
Definitely. And Lisa, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It's really utterly fascinating to have that uh, vision or that window into 19th century Jewish life in Ukraine. Is really amazing. We have some time for some questions. If you could put the questions in the Q&A, that would be best. And I see there's a couple questions here already. Okay. All right. Well, I'll send you, this was a question like whether you had an email, but we'll send that to you separately. Um, let's see. Okay. Neither question's really that relevant to what we're going on. So I had a question, which is I think it's really interesting that you went back to Pavlich. What's it called today? Is it called
It's still called Pavlich. In Russian, the signposts were in Russian when we were there, and it's spelled with an O, Pavloch. But generally, where there's an O in Russian, like Zaporozhye, we in Ukrainian, and as we now want to use the Ukrainian, we would call it Zaporizhia, so we would call it Pavlich, which is exactly what my grandma called it.
Amazing. It's really amazing. And I'm
And
just
the old,
seeing,
I would just say a word about it. That so the old
please.
synagogue, the synagogue has been turned into a little museum.
Uh-huh.
They have a copy of my book there. They got in touch with me and asked, and I managed to send them, even in spite of the war, the Postal Service of Ukraine works, and a book arrived there. Um,
Incredible.
and got lovely displays. My dad and I were shown around by an old school teacher, a very elderly man. I think he's passed now, but he showed us all around the exhibit quite a lot about Jewish history and the history of the town in general, and obviously it's all totally out of bounds now. This is
Right.
an area that's been devastated by war, but we hope that that war will end. And when it does, I would recommend to anybody to go back to the old country and visit your ancestral villages if you know where they are and if you get the chance.
Yeah, that was a great advice, and I hope people do so. Obviously, when it's safe to do so.
When it's safe to do so.
Yeah. So a few questions that we have here, which I'd like to share with you. So how's it that you have so many photos?
I think partly because my grandmother was just really family orientated, and
Hmm.
so she kept quite a lot of photos, and it's been fascinating since the book came out. Relatives on all sides of my family have got in touch with me and said, "Hey, we're fourth cousins, three times removed, or
Wow.
whatever," and people from all over the US, all over Canada, Israel, some in the UK even, and interestingly, some of the same family photos have come up. So cousins in New York who I knew nothing about, who are Orthodox Jews, sent me a photo that is exactly the same as a photo that
Wow.
that we have. So I think we're just lucky. We're just lucky.
Oh, so true. I'm wondering, somebody asked a question, and I have a friend who lives in Winnipeg about that. Winnipeg, Ukraine, Winnipeg, Los Angeles connection. I mean, is that something kind of typical that people would go from Winnipeg to Los Angeles?
I'm not sure that Winnipeg to Los Angeles was a particularly sort of common move. My dad went to UCLA, so that's what he kind of bummed around for quite a while, but he ended up at UCLA. But the Pavlich to Winnipeg is interesting. There was a Pavlich synagogue in Winnipeg. There was a
Wow.
Pavlich community, half the world away. And when my grandma reached Winnipeg in 1924, suddenly there were all these people from her past who she might not have necessarily noticed leaving Pavlich, but
Wow.
that became a really well-worn route.
That was fascinating. Okay, just looking at, we have some more questions here. Um, when you mentioned Banda, so so were those Cossacks, or who were those people?
Yeah, so the Cossacks. So I mentioned when Pearl's grandfather was hanged from the meat hook. That was the Cossacks. They were the White Army. Their leader was a Cossack, General Denikin. But there were up to a dozen of these different banda. So there were, the Red Army, grandma considered a banda. There were people you may have heard of Petlura, Semyon Petlura, who was one of the nationalist leaders of Ukraine. There was the Petlurist banda. There were local sort of local strongmen. There was a guy called Makhno, and she talked about the Makhnoists, Makhno's banda, Skoropadsky's banda. They were different. Some of them were anarchists, some of them were nationalists, some of them were a mixture of the two. Um, you had a banda for every for every eventuality almost, and some of them were just bands of people, just like gangs, bringing their gang together and wreaking havoc.
Right. No, it's fascinating. Obviously, a fascinating and tragic era in Russian history in general, and Russian Jewish history of the area. Um, Another question here is, how did you learn about the details about how the traders functioned? Was that all from the recordings, or did were you able to get that from other sources?
Yeah, a bit of both. So, Grandma did talk about it, and that was something that my dad was particularly interested in. So he questioned her a lot about her grandfather's work and what it was like and how they did business. So that was a lot of that was his questioning. But I did a lot of research. I was because I'd started this doing this master's at UCL, University College London, very prestigious university that has a massive library of every book on that's pretty much that's ever been published. I was able to get access to the library and get hold of loads of books that it would be very difficult to get access to otherwise. So I did manage to find some accounts of just different aspects of life um, in 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 the Russian Empire, and people's lives, people's recollections, people's experiences, and also the immigrants, the early Jewish immigrant communities in America and Canada.
Fascinating. I think we have a couple more minutes, and I know that we're kind of running out of time, but let me see if there's some other questions that we can ask. Oh, okay, so um, um, a couple people asked about where they can purchase the book and how they can
Yeah,
purchase the book.
so I think you should be receiving a link to it on Amazon in the follow-up email that you'll be receiving. Um,
Great.
if you don't, then contact JewishGen, contact me via my website, and you will get hold of that link. If
Okay.
all else fails, you can also get it from the publisher, who is called Penina Press. They're in Israel, and you can order directly from them if Amazon is out of stock or you can't get hold of it on Amazon.
Okay, super. Thank you. Um, just one more question, and that is, do you have your family tree on any of the genealogical websites so people
No,
could check and I guess compare?
I don't, because I've not I haven't had the time to get involved in it. Something I want to do when I retire is actually sort of start doing my own genealogy research. But one place you can find some of it on my grandmother's on her grandfather, the grain trader, and his side of the family, his father and his brothers. There is a website called schneers.com. That's SHNIERS.com. Um, that could maybe go out into the follow-up email as well. But so the Schneers are all over Winnipeg. They're a Winnipeg family. My great grandfather's brother is the top of that family tree, and they have done masses of research. There's fascinating stuff in there. There's the whole load of copies of all the documents of how the family managed to emigrate to Canada, with all the different documents from both sides, and there's a massive family tree on there. So that may be worth looking at. That's gone up, schneers.com. I can see that's gone up on the chat. Thank you to whoever put that up. So have a look at that, and maybe one day I will get around to getting onto the genealogy sites.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That was really a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and I believe everybody else here did as well. And as you said, so many contacts or so many connections with everybody, people whose families are from the Russian Empire. So much stuff that was so resonant. Thank you so much, and we really had a great pleasure and very meaningful to learn from you today.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting me. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Take care. Oh, be well, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.